Hello everyone, welcome to With the People, a podcast dedicated to all things anime, from the perspectives of an advanced viewer, casual, and beginner. I am your host, Daniel Posada.
I just maxed out my professor level on Fire Emblem Three Houses, so you can call me Malcolm, i.e. Lisa, the Hammond teacher. My name's, Malcolm.
Damn! That was like 3 references in one.
Yeah, 3 houses, dog. Fucking keep up.
3 houses.
Layers, and I'm your droning but context-rich professor, Jake.
Yes, yeah, no, I'm only at a C+ right now.
Amateur hour.
I passed the course, so we're good.
And that's why we're qualified to teach you about history.
And that's why we're qualified to teach you history. So in today's episode, we'll be delving into history. We'll be talking about World War II and its effects on anime as a whole. Disclaimer, we're not historians, but and we're not going to talk about the entirety of World War II, or else we'd be here for the next couple of weeks not getting up and talking about it. So it's going to be super condensed, and I took Japanese history courses in college, but that was over 4 years ago, so I had to use some good old references. For the most part, we should be good. I know Jake's a huge World War II buff, but I think he's more of a
I'm like chomping at the bit, just like waiting to like, all right, this is my moment.
Yeah, his chains are about to break loose.
But yeah, we're not gonna be talking about the Western Front. We're not gonna be talking about Germany's front with Russia, or the African campaigns. We are specifically talking about the Pacific Theater, but really trying to focus on Japan as a nation. During the war, and then kind of like the post-World War II recovery process as well. Because, spoiler alert, things did not go well for them for a while. It was not good.
It was no bueno. So
it was no bueno.
Yeah. So, in case y'all forgot exactly what happened, here is an incredibly abridged and condensed version of the events of World War II. So Germany invaded Poland August 31st, 1939. And then Great Britain and France declared war on Germany September 3rd, 1939, thus starting like an official start date for World War II, right? Then Japan was seen by Germany and Italy as a supreme power in the Far East, and the Tripartite, or the Axis Pact of September 27th, 1940 was signed, thus combining the Axis powers. Japan then invaded Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, and the U.S. entered the war. Knock, knock. It's the U.S. At that point,
I heard you wanted a dose of freedom. I mean freedom.
Yeah, oil, freedom, same thing, right? They're synonymous. Let's see. Yeah, and a lot of stuff happened in between the next 4 years. And finally, on August 6th and 9th, 1945, the 2 atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And then finally on August 10th, 1945, the Japanese surrendered, and the Pacific Theater came to a close.
Yep.
Yeah, that was our incredibly condensed version of World War II, and Jake's just frothing at the mouth.
Kids are fucking ready to take the history portion of the SAT, because got you.
We got the Spark Notes for sure. It's not going to help you on the multiple choice quiz of what was Hitler wearing on December 7th, 1943. That's not going to help you. You had to watch
from Old Navy.
You had to watch the movie to really know.
You had to watch the director's cut.
But yeah, Daniel summed it up pretty nice. Things to note were that Germany, sparking this confrontation of war by invading Poland. That was the line in the sand where Great Britain and France had said, "Hey, you invade this area. We've already given you certain territories. You invade this area, we are going to war." And then they did. The interesting part is Japan enters in an allyship with Germany about a year. It's like almost a year later from Germany starting the war. And then over a year later, it took for the U.S. to enter the war. This is kind of the interesting part that I've always liked about history and like all the what ifs. Like FDR was giving weapons and aid to the UK, and then also trying to help France, but France was basically a resistance force by this point. Germany had taken it over. but he could only ship weapons and supplies. He could not enter the war. There were plenty of people in the U.S. who were like, "Not my pig, not my farm. Don't get in there. This is not our deal." That's from Letterkenny. That's a little bit.
Yeah,
in there.
they were very. It was like a weird kind of climate in the U.S. It was very. A lot of people were still feeling neutral about it. They didn't want to like dive in.
Yeah, a lot of reasons. World War One, pretty brutal. Not many people benefiting, and definitely carved up the Middle East, which is where we got the repercussions of today. But to really summarize, the U.S. did not feel like this was a war that they were supposed to get involved with. They were like, that's Europe's problem. We dealt with this before. We sent troops over for a very brief period of time in World War One. And now, we've gone through the Great Depression. Like, we got to take care of our own. We're not going to go over there and fight. And then comes Japan. And
Hello.
It's like...
Moshi mosh.
Moshi mosh.
Moshi mosh. Probably one of my favorite SpongeBob memes out of this was like, oh yeah, it was like Japan and Germany sign a pact. We're like allies now. And he's like, great, we bombed the US. And they're like, you what? Yeah, Japan bombing the U.S. Gave us the legitimate excuse to enter the war, and because Japan and Germany were allied, we were like, cool. I guess it's cool for both of us. Like, we can go both fronts. We're going to go in the Pacific theater, and we're going to go in the European theater. So I think that's very interesting that Japan had a big influence on our impact in World War II.
Yes.
Yeah. What a lot of people don't know is that, well, in America, Russia was primarily responsible for ending World War II, defeating the Germans. I think 4 out of every 5 casualties in the war came on the Eastern Front between those two. And like, if we hadn't got into this war, because if Japan hadn't bombed us, it's very interesting to think of like what the makeup of the world would be like and how less influence we might have in critical areas of the world.
Yeah, for sure. If y'all are interested, this is actually my once in a lifetime non-anime recommendation. But if you're interested in like possible what ifs, like if the Axis powers had won, on Amazon Prime, there is The Man in the High Castle, based off the book in the same name. And it is exactly that. It's where the Allied power is lost, and yeah, it takes an entire different perspective, and it's really cool. I enjoyed the show.
Yeah.
But with that, so that's where the majority. We're gonna delve into it a little bit more, but just as a little hint, that's where the majority of like German influence came from. Obviously, is that that connection in the Axis powers, but the American influence doesn't come in until actually after the war. So let's dive into that portion now. So let's see. The time period was right after the war, 1945, 1952. In comes the U.S., and obviously the Allied powers are talking about what's going to happen with Japan. And at this point, we have General Douglas A. MacArthur. He's given the supreme command of the Allied powers in Japan. So what that means and what that entailed was that he was basically in charge of what's called the occupation and reconstruction of Japan, and it involved massive political, social, and economic reforms. And because of those reforms, we have the Japan that we have today. Japan's constitution was completely rewritten. They dismantled the military. So now in this time, Japan, even till today, Japan does not have a military. They have what's called the Japan Self-Defense Force, or JITI in Japanese. And Japan cannot actually go offensive with their quote-unquote military.
Yep.
They could only use it for defensive purposes. So they still, in essence, they still have a military, but they are legally bound in that they cannot use it as a military and only as kind of like a police force, if you want to think of it like that.
This is exactly what we did with the Germans after World War One as well. It was like you cut their forces down to, okay, you could use this as a defensive force, but nothing useful for offense.
Yeah. And then let's see, from military, they started focusing more on economics to now in the current day, Japan's one of the greatest economic powers in the world.
Man, would you look at that?
Yeah.
Stop spending money on war, and good lord, you have Japan.
And you have good things that happen.
Yeah.
The political system was completely torn down. Emperor Hirohito, he was basically, because he was, at the time, he was seen as like this like god, like a god complex, like in all honesty. But then after the war, he like, his position of power just completely dropped. It became a more democratic sort of government.
Yeah,
and
it's like a ceremonial position, kind of like the Queen of England now.
Yes, exactly. So throughout this entire period of occupation and reconstruction, American influence in Japan like grew exponentially. Because of this occupation and reconstruction era, like the Japanese language has taken so many loan words from the English language because of this occupation, to the point where there's a lot of words that, like for example, necktie. I think for the majority of Japanese people actually say necktie. So
that's interesting.
And then like party, party. So like it's gotten to the point where English loanwords, that version is actually used more commonly than the Japanese version of the word, if that makes sense.
That's I mean, I could see that. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of words in like in American culture that aren't necessarily American words, right?
Yeah. Like taco.
Like taco. All right.
Piñata.
That's a low-hanging fruit. But yeah, piñata. Or like how like some people would say like hola, like in the morning, like just hello.
Yeah. Well, howdy, partner.
Well, howdy, partner. Oh yeah, and seeing you around these parts.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think one thing that's really interesting is Japan's success can, post-war can be accredited to obviously the tenacity of their people to recover. But it was very interesting that we took a strategy with Japan after really devastating them during the war to do this rebuilding process and to make sure that we're putting money back in their economy. This is one of the things that gets political after World War II. There was backroom deals with FDR and Stalin to actually say like, hey, after the war, Russia's going to need help recovering. This has been devastating to us. Germany's going to need help recovering. There were all these like political moves where Europe's like, hey, I don't want you to fix Germany because that's scary. We don't want to deal with this a third time. So those were honest beliefs by a lot of people at the time. It's like, don't give them a leg to stand on. And then a lot of people were concerned about Russia being this military powerhouse again. So we didn't give a lot of funding to Russia. That actually fell through, and they actually went through some pretty hard recession/depressions after the war. Germany was a little bit better off. Divided country, but there was a lot of Western cash being flushed in there to recover. Same thing with Japan. There was a lot of incentive for us to rebuild that area, maybe not out of charity, but as a very prime location next to Russia. So,
yeah, it's interesting because like going back to when the Americans decided to bomb Japan, a lot of the impact was because of Russia. Russia declared war on Japan because they were like, hey, we want some of that land though. And the Americans were like, oh shit, we don't want Russia getting any of this shit. So
yeah. That's a prime location.
Yeah, Russia declared. I forget the date that Russia declared war, but literally like a couple days after, they were like, okay, yeah, let's fucking drop these bombs.
Yeah.
And Russia and Japan, that goes back even further in the early 1900s or 20th century, with the Japanese-Russo War. Like that was a whole nother conflict of it in itself, another podcast episode.
Yeah, we could talk about that one on its own.
Yeah,
I think that'd be good.
Yeah. But it's really interesting to hear how like even within the Allied powers and most of it, all these backroom deals, it's always worrying about Russia. at this period of time. It's like,
Right.
okay, what's Russia doing? Even though there are quote unquote allies, right? It's like,
Right.
it's
There's
not
a
like,
layer of mistrust there for
Yeah.
sure.
So
Yeah, I think that.
Go for it. Sorry.
Yeah, I think that one's really interesting, and I'm glad you mentioned the bombs because I don't think we could get away from this episode without mentioning those.
Yeah.
Yeah, probably the most controversial move in the entire war, at least in the Pacific Theater, was using atomic weapons once we had them. There's there's cases that I hear from several sides of the story and like historians of what were the decisions that went around making the bombs drop, and one of them is pretty clear that with Russia invading or planning to invade, we wanted a display of power in the U.S. to push them out. So we dropped these bombs as a display of that atomic power, and that was kind of a political move for the world to know that the U.S. has this incredible weapon. Another one would be that as we were pushing into mainland Japan, part of that warrior culture was no retreat, no surrender, and our casualties on both sides were escalating like wildly as we got closer to the mainland. So that's been used as a reason of why we dropped the weapons, is so that we could avoid these island hop campaigns where we build these building casualties as we approach the mainland. There's actually like a weird side story where there were people that were dropped into these islands to hold them out, Japanese soldiers, and they had stayed on the mainland, gathering guns and ammo, living in the forest, like just surviving up into the 60s and 70s. And they would find these people, and they were like, "I'm not leaving. This is my command, and unless I get a direct order from my head commander saying to pull off this attack, this is what I do." Like that's kind of the level of commitment we're talking about here. So they actually flew this it was
like a retired
army
dude, I remember.
Retired dude. He's like 70 years old. He came out to the island and was like, "Yeah, you're done. Like you can go home now." And the guy just dropped his stuff and went home. But he had to wait for his commander to give him that order. So there were orders by Japan of no retreat, no surrender, heavily tied to honor about, fighting to the end. So there is a reasonable case for that. But I think probably the most destructive is that these were not military targets. These were cities. They were just where people lived. And there were military targets in those cities, but an atomic bomb does not discriminate. That is going to kill everybody. So
equality
I think
at its finest, don't you?
Quality at its finest. It is a non-discriminatory bomb that will just destroy everything in its path. And I believe 60,000 or so people died in this attack.
It was a lot.
And this is the only time atomic weapons have been used on populated targets.
Yeah.
We'll ignore the nuclear testing in the Pacific where some fishing vessels were destroyed.
Going back kind of to what you were talking about, that whole mentality of never surrender, never retreat. Trying to bring it back towards anime, right? It got to the point where even the citizens themselves, they'd be instead of getting captured and stuff, the Japanese government, Emperor Hirohito, he was like, "Hey, instead of getting captured by these filthy Americans, you need to just kill yourself. It's a much better fate than being captured by these dudes." And it's interesting because nowadays Japan is very military opposed to the military and opposed to conflict, opposed to all that. And it's interesting because all this happened we're in 2020 almost. So 70 years ago was all this reconstruction, and you can see it in their laws and their gun laws right now. You can own a personal firearm, but you have to register it with the government. You have to show them a blueprint of your house, exactly where it is in the house, how many bullets you're carrying, where the safe is. I think you even have to disclaim the how to open the safe that the gun is in. And
the NRA is shaking right now, Daniel.
Huh?
The NRA
Oh,
is
the NRA
shaking
is
right
strong.
now.
So, and you can see that in a lot of the anime shows that
Mhm.
that are coming out now. Like obviously, like there's like fighting shows and like violent shows or whatever. But if you really like delve into the details of whenever it deals with firearms in the modern era, kind of like
Mhm.
that setting, you can even see it within the shows themselves. Off the top of my mind, I don't have an exact example, but I have
Mhm.
seen that in shows, and it's really
Yeah.
interesting to note how so much, like all these past events that occurred so long ago, still have a dramatic effect to this day,
Yeah.
in just a form of media of just broadcasting that. Of always wanting to make sure that okay, we're not going to broadcast like super military stuff, blah 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 blah. But on that note, there are exceptions. Um, there's an anime that's out. It's a good one. I like the show. Where did I write it? Here it is. Gate thus the Japanese Gate thus the Japanese Self Defense Force fought there.
Mouthful.
Yeah, that's why.
That is a great Fall Out Boy
Yeah,
song.
seriously. That anime I feel like is a huge Self Defense Force promotion, mixed in with like the trend of oh what are the hip and happening right now? What's going on? And it's an isekai of like the Japanese military like finds this gate and they go through this gate and it's like in a fantasy world, medieval and shit. And it's like this whole
Oh,
like oh
interesting.
what is like modern technology versus like medieval shit. And
Oh, interesting.
yeah, so it's a good watch. I really enjoyed it. But yeah, that's like a huge, just like, hey, if you want to have the chance to go to another world, join the Self Defense Force. And I'm like, damn, that's some solid propaganda right there.
Yeah, good
Ooh, you will
recruiting.
definitely get sent to another world.
It's like all those
death.
it's like all those Call of Duty like co-ops with the US military.
Yeah.
Oh
God.
yeah,
Those commercials are so bad. Holy shit.
Yep.
Yeah. But yeah, we do see, military influence like you had mentioned there, Girls in Panzer. Yeah, I could send the name. They're talking about panzer tanks like German era tank machinery and tank warfare. The other one that I would mention here that I don't see on the list is Akira. We had talked about that. That was all about post World War II anxieties of nuclear fallout, deformed humans, people with like different abilities and weapons. Like obviously, like a positive spin on radiation exposure, and not just like death, like the reality, which is just dead people. But that there is a lot of thought about how the war was ended, the weapons that were used against them, and then also just kind of the brutality that you have to look at the mirror and you have to face like there was brutality about that culture, and they've sought ways of reforming that.
yeah, for sure. There's also another anime that I didn't write in the list, but it's on Netflix. It's a good movie. It's called In This Corner of the World, and it depicts a Japanese family during the World War II era, and like how they're trying to just get on by, trying to live, trying to do their daily stuff, while in the background you hear all like the fighter planes going around, and it deals more with not the atomic bombs, but the Tokyo fire bombings, which in actuality have been shown to have had caused more casualties than the bombs themselves, the atomic bombs themselves.
Yeah, because most of Japan was wooden structures, right?
Yes.
So like when you
man,
firebomb
fire,
stuff,
oh man, that fire caught everywhere.
Yeah.
So yeah, like the Tokyo fire bombings. But yeah, if you're interested in like a different take, In This Corner of the World, great movie. I recommend it for sure.
and that's anime,
But-
right?
Yes. It's
Beautiful.
an
I'll have to
animated
check it
movie.
out.
Yeah. And then continuing on with other anime influences, to this day, like Kill la Kill has huge German influences. If you look into the details, like a lot of the characters, their names or their moves and stuff have German influences. I'm not gonna.
Another
spoil
one I
anything.
can think of was Attack on Titan, right?
Attack on Titan. I mean, dude, the guy's name's Aaron
The
Yeager.
literal theme song.
Like,
Yeah.
The Jaeger.
and then on more American concepts, besides like the English loanwords and stuff, you have My Hero Academia. That's just a huge oh, let's take the concept of Western superheroes and throw it into an anime.
Let's take the United States and take every individual state and make it a punch. And Detroit.
Yes.
Detroit's not a state. But
Detroit has its own punch.
Yeah, Detroit's its own
it
punch.
does.
Yeah, so that's another great one, another great show. But yeah, so as y'all have heard and listened, many of these past events, World War II, had huge influences throughout how Japan has been structured as a whole, and how that structure and culture change has led to differences in, or not differences, but how anime is made, and like the concepts and the perspectives that they take on those shows.
Yeah. And I think I'd want to jump in here just at the end. We hit on all the big points like I'd want to talk about, which was like the atomic bombs and kind of the recovery process, and of course anime. One thing I wanted to talk about was maybe Western acceptance of Japanese culture, and like maybe some of the troubles that come up because of the history. I don't think it's as big of a deal now, but I think certainly decades ago there were huge problems with racism against the Japanese people because of the effects of World War II. One thing I can think of is our internment camps of Japanese Japanese citizens in the U.S. They are not, when I say Japanese citizens, Japanese origin U.S. citizens that were detained and put into camps in the U.S. because they were suspected of being sympathizers for Japan during the war. Very controversial. One would say unconstitutional, but that's for another time and place. And then I think also the treatment of American POWs in Japanese internment camps as well, or not internment camps, probably better word for them is POW camps. Brutal treatment of those soldiers. And then I think there's this backlash of how quickly the war was ended, from this brutal like slogging out on islands, everyone dying, to all right, war's over. And now you have two sides that obviously there are huge tensions between, and bad blood between military servicemen. One example I could think of was in Mad Men, one of the CEOs almost blows a interview with Honda because he just like cannot get over the war, because he was a GI in the war in the Pacific Theater, and is insulting them, making racial jabs, everything, because there's like this personal pain that he feels about losing his brothers in the war. I don't know, like we're getting off on a tangent, and that's like hard to put on a macro level, but when you have cultures that have put each other through extreme hardships and then try to put a piece together so quickly, it takes a long time to iron out those creases. And I think a lot of what we may have seen as Japanese culture being weird, off-putting, wrong, strange, I think there's a lot of that resistance that's finally being broken down, and people exploring and understanding humor in other cultures and like style and art. And that's kind of one of my favorite things about anime, is that it's kind of this bridge of being exposed to a culture without fully understanding it. It's kind of a way and a gateway for people in the West to enjoy this. So
no, for sure, that was so well put. Good job.
Oh, thanks, guys.
Guys, thank you, Professor Campbell, for guest lecturing today.
Oh, thank you all. I'm going to be taking a sabbatical for the next 6 months, and we'll be back.
We lost your check, so don't expect any payment.
Malcolm, do you want to throw in anything?
Not really. History is really not my thing, but I never really thought about it in the sense of we were bombed by Japan, so I would see the immediate reason to just kind of shove off all of Japanese culture as like, fuck that country and everything that it produces. Yep. So like, given time, like with the whole civil rights movement, people forget that it's only been like 60 years since that happened, but like things get better over time. Americans just take a fuck ton of time to get over things. But I think we're finally getting to that point where it's like the turnover period where it's like, you know what, Japan,
you're cool now.
They're just like us. We're all humans. Yeah. You know what?
You're a You're a little
Yeah.
freaky sometimes, but you know what? It's all right.
We still love you.
there we go.
We still love you, and we accept you, Japan.
We accept you. All right. Well, with that, this wraps up this episode. References used for this episode were Britannica and the Department of State's Office of Historian websites. We would like to thank Joachim Karud for his use of his music in our podcast. The intro is Dreams and the outro is Lowrider. Links to his contact info will be in our show notes. If you enjoy listening to us, please make sure to rate us on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Check out our website, weebthepeople.com, and make sure to follow our Twitter handle at weeb_the_people for future updates. And finally, if you have any questions, either DM us on Twitter or email us at weebthepeoplepodcast@gmail.com. Thank you for listening to my lecture. I am your professor, Mr. Posada.
I kind of sat in the back like a teacher's assistant. My name's Malcolm.
And the atomic bomb changed the shape of the executive office forever. My name is Jake. Have a good evening.
This has been Weeb the People, and have a great evening.
Is that why they call it the Oval Office?
Oh, like it's like Fat Man. Yeah, it's got the little boom.